Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of the Cloud Miners, which is episode 21 of season 3 of Star Trek The Original Series. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as requested by my viewers. This episode was requested by Allison Fordyce. So the Cloud Miners is the episode where, while on a mission to retrieve much-needed supplies for a planet suffering through a plague, the Enterprise travels to a planet where the rich and elite live in cities in the clouds while the workers live in underground mines below. When Kirk attempts to retrieve the supplies, he finds himself in the middle of the conflict between the workers and the elite, and the workers known as troglodytes make multiple attempts to abduct him and hold him hostage. McCoy discovers that the hostile nature of the troglodytes is due to a byproduct gas of the mines and suggests a mask that would shield the miners from the effect. However, neither the city dwellers nor the troglodytes believe Kirk when he tells them about the gas, so Kirk abducts the leaders of both sides and takes them into a sealed-off mine so they can witness the effects of the gas firsthand. After being convinced of the gas effect, they come to an agreement which sees the troglodytes begin to gain more privileges, and the Enterprise gets their much-needed supplies, and they go on their merry way. So the Cloud Miners has always been a favorite of mine. In fact, when I did my original top 10 6 years ago, this episode made it at number 10. However, it didn't make it to the top 10 that I did the revised list that I did earlier this year. And watching this episode again, I actually see there are a lot of flaws in this episode that bother me, and they always have. However, I was initially attracted to this episode for several reasons. First of all is the fact that it had gone so overlooked. Virtually no one had talked about it. Most episodes of the original series, be it Naked Time, City on the Edge of Forever, Mirror Mirror, Doomsday Machine, The Enterprise Incident, or The Tholian Web, I've heard about in some form or another before watching it. This episode I never heard of, and it seemed to come out of nowhere. And while there were a few other episodes like that, most of those are not good. Whereas this one I found quite entertaining, so was surprised that it was so overlooked. And I suppose that attracted me more to this episode. The other reason is its powerful social commentary, which is why I suppose it made my list back in 2010 when I used to be much more politically minded, and social commentary went a long way with me. But watching it now, I still agree and appreciate the commentary, but I just think it was executed. The way it was executed was a bit obvious and simplistic. The theme of the episode, of course, being a class-based system of operation and the differences between the haves and the have-nots. It reminds me a lot of the original Time Machine novel, which the poor workers living underground coming up and abducting the rich people living in luxury. But I suppose a more apt comparison would be the classic sci-fi film Metropolis, which the creators of the episode bring up as an inspiration, as it was about an elite class that lived in sky towers and with the workers below having no privileges. Although having never seen that movie myself, I can't speak much to that. However, the message is as old as time. Those with wealth and power benefiting off of the hard work and labor from those who don't get to reap any benefits of their own labor, while those who do get the benefits live a luxurious life of leisure. But more specifically, this episode gets into the disconnect that happens in the minds of those who reap the benefits of the hard labor of others, as they see themselves as superior and worthy of such treatment, while the workers are not, and they simply have no idea what the workers' lives are like, and are in fact perplexed when the workers bother to complain about their quality of life. This is a message that is still very strongly resonates today, although I suppose it would have been more relevant to modern day society had those living in luxury were believing that they were the hard workers and that the laborers were just lazy, which is why they weren't getting any of the luxuries. But close enough. Anyways, as I said, I was impressed, and I still do appreciate the commentary this episode makes. As I said, the way it does it is a bit simplistic, as it's a bit too obvious what the message is, as the characters in this episode even use very obvious language, such as the Stratos city dwellers referring to the troglodytes as inferior and incapable of comprehending logic or appreciating art. And then there's the storyline with the Zeenite Gas, which apparently was the sole cause of the troglodytes' hostile nature. This plotline has come under attack from multiple sources, none the least being the writer who originally came up with the idea for this episode, which was significantly different than the version we see here on screen. The original script was actually more obviously an analogy to the civil rights movement of the 60s, featuring a Martin Luther King Jr. type character and a Malcolm X type character who would be at odds with each other. However, these elements were watered down for the final shooting script, and perhaps understandably so, considering the civil rights movement of the 60s was still in full swing when this episode was created, and the death of Martin Luther King only occurred a year previously. Not saying I agree, but I didn't think the network heads would let something so controversial by. However, the ultimate script is more of a generic class, desperation story, and more of, moreover, the Zeenite Gas element actually downplays the social strife involved by those being oppressed, as it blames their aggressive behavior entirely on this unseen gas. The writer of the original draft even stated that the ending of the episode aired has an analogy that's kind of like, oh, we were just appeasing the darkies so they can go back and be content in picking cotton and just shut up. And I think that's a bit harsh. I don't think that's not really the message I got from the ending here. As although the troglodytes went back to the mines, they seem to be opening negotiations for them being allowed to the Cloud Cities more often and for them to gain more privileges in general. Which makes sense, because such social change would realistically be very gradual and wouldn't just happen overnight. So overall, I do feel the social commentary still really works. However, I do agree that the Zeenite Gas storyline was a bit unnecessary, and in fact, I totally do not buy how the situation is resolved by Kirk, by him forcing Vala and Placis to experience the gas firsthand. As they were so entirely adamant that the gas didn't exist, they both could have just very easily dismissed their violent behavior as being them just being tired or aggravated by Kirk abducting them, and perhaps helped by the lack of oxygen. The moment when Vala called out, "Captain, the Zeenite Gas!" was so fake and telegraphed. I really did not buy it. And speaking of how strongly both Vala and Placis were resistant to Kirk's suggestion of the Zeenite Gas being the cause of the troglodytes' violent behavior, I totally didn't buy this either. Both of them seemed to be acting absurdly obtuse, as Kirk and McCoy had scientific evidence of the cause of the Zeenite Gas. Although I suppose one could bring up analogies like climate change denial as an example of those refusing to accept plain scientific facts because it goes against their own personal ideology, but I don't think that quite applies here, as it's not really that far-fetched, and they didn't really make them question their worldview. And with Vala, such information actually helps her cause. So I found the fact that they were so easy to dismiss Kirk a bit unbelievable. And for that matter, I feel Vala was being absurdly obtuse as well, as she was continuing to insist that Kirk and the Enterprise were there to somehow oppress the troglodytes. First of all, I'm not even sure what she'd think that would entail, and secondly, Kirk makes no attempt to oppress them, and he keeps repeating that he's only concerned about getting the supplies of Zeenite, and everything he does reinforces this assessment. So you'd actually have to be an idiot to think that the Enterprise was there to oppress them. Now, one might argue, well, maybe she was being affected by the Zeenite Gas, but if you recall, they specifically mentioned that Vala was behaving a lot more intelligently and more clever than the other troglodytes, which Kirk concluded was because she spent a lot of time in Stratos away from the effect of the Zeenite Gas, which means that excuse for Vala's idiotic behavior would not hold up. Anything that seems really out of place watching this episode in retrospect is that this planet is referred to as a member of the Federation, which, knowing what we know now about the Federation, this is really hard to believe. First of all, it's since been established that there is a long, vigorous vetting system that takes years, sometimes decades, for a planet to be accepted into the Federation. In order for a planet to be accepted, it has to be deemed as significantly advanced and enlightened. The class system this planet operates would automatically disqualify as the majority of the population live in poverty and basically being oppressed by the elite minority that live in luxury. In addition, the leaders of the world still implement torture on its own citizens as a common practice. These things, I dare say, would not fly with the Federation Council. Furthermore, for a Federation world, Kirk and Spock are rather ignorant of this world, as they know absolutely nothing about the most basic structure of its society, which would seem to be like incompetence for them. But the real explanation for this inconsistency is that the United Federation of Planets, as imagined in the original series, was quite different than as presented in the later spin-off series, whereas in Next Generation times, the Federation is portrayed more as an analogy for the United States, where each planet is like a state, but they're united as one nation, whereas the original series, the Federation is more like United Nations, where it's just a very loose alliance with strictly autonomous worlds who only have like very loose trade agreements, which is certainly how it's portrayed here. Now, one may try to make the in-universe excuse that perhaps this is what it was like in the original series times and it evolved to become more concrete in the Next Generation times, except for the fact that the original series movies also portray the Federation more like a single nation. So the real explanation is it had yet to be established in the original series time what the Federation was, and it wasn't until the spin-off series and films where it was made clear. Furthermore, Placis threatens to kill Kirk several times, which of course would be absolutely unheard of and unacceptable for an official head of a Federation world to threaten a Starfleet captain with execution. And more than that, the scene itself where Placis tells his soldiers, "If Captain Kirk appeals again, kill him," felt really ridiculous. I mean, really kill him just because you gotten into an argument? This really paints Placis as a ruthless dictator. But more than that, it just feels like a really artificial way for the episode to create tension right before the commercial break. And Placis, of course, never follows through on this threat, so the whole thing is just an obvious ploy. There was also one of the biggest technical blunders the original series has ever done in this episode. I noticed it even when I first saw this episode when I was like 12 years old. In the first scene after the credits where Kirk and Spock are being held in ropes by Vala in the Triglide, Kirk says, "Who are you? What is the meaning of this?" But his lips don't move. And it was just so obviously odd. You can very clearly see that Kirk's lips are not moving. So this was ADR that was added after the episode was shot. And while I actually agree that these lines did enhance the scene and added tension, you just don't fucking add dialogue while showing the person who's supposed to be speaking and seeing that he's clearly not talking. I mean, this is such an easy fix. Simply have the dialogue play over a shot of Vala and the others listening, and then cut back to Kirk when his lips actually move. I know the original series is filled with a lot of bad and obvious mistakes, such as the very many times in which Shatner's stunt double was so painfully obviously noticeable. But to me, this is the worst offense, mainly because the fix would have been such an easy one. And apparently some forms of networks that aired this episode actually took the line out of the episodes because it was just so bad. But on the positive side, I did really like how the episode avoided the typical love interest cliche. In fact, making Vala a woman, it was really out of character for the original series to have her not at least kiss Kirk. As even in other examples where a woman is the villain, Kirk still ends up making out with her, such as the episode Wink of an Eye. But here, they don't even hint at it. Although there is that one uncomfortable scene where Vala tries to assassinate Kirk in bed, and he ends up pinning her down in bed and holding her down by her wrists against her will, and he refers to it as quite enjoyable. Yeah, that scene was a bit uncomfortable to watch. But for the most part, Vala is a rare example of a truly badass female character who's never played as a love interest in the original series. I mean, sure, as I mentioned, she's being absurdly obtuse, but so are the male characters in this episode. And ultimately, she does turn out to be a very strong leader and a force to be reckoned with, so I quite liked her character. However, there is a love interest in this episode, but it's more directed at Spock, as Plastis' daughter, Draxine, is the more effeminate, more sexualized character who just swoons over Spock the whole time, but nothing ever comes of it. And I really enjoyed that they do give Spock his due rather than making it Kirk every time. I like how they even hinted at this kind of in a sort of meta fashion by having Plastis assume Kirk was the one Draxine was swooning over, when in fact it was Spock. I particularly like the scene where Spock is explaining the Vulcan 7-year itch to her, and she asks if there's anything that could disturb this cycle, and Spock replies that great beauty is often disturbing. And it almost seemed like he was falling for her when he said that line, but I did really love the double meaning of there. So my rating out of 10 for Cloud Miners is an 8, extremely good. This episode does have quite a few flaws that bother me, but ultimately I think the commentary on the class separation is very powerful and relevant in a timeless way. But more than that, I really like this episode. I think an episode stands out in a unique fashion as an episode that explores the cultural aspects of an alien world in a way most original series episodes don't. And also seeing Kirk try to be a diplomatic negotiator is also a rare thing. I feel really works well in this episode. So that's it for my review of the Cloud Miners. If there's an episode from any of the 5 Star Trek series that you would like me to review, just leave a request in the comment section below, but please only 1 episode request per person. And be sure to check out my channel for many more Star Trek videos, as well as many other videos on other shows like Game of Thrones, Dark Matter, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.